Bienvenidos todos al tercer y último día de sesión.
Welcome to the third and last day of the sessions of this meeting of the Internet Governance Forum of Latin America and the Caribbean, LACIGF 13. We remind you that we are recording the sessions in the original language. Hence, anybody who's interested in listening to it again may have access to it. It will be available in the website of LACNIC. Remember that you have simultaneous interpretation in English, Portuguese, and Spanish, and you may access interpreting through the globe that you see at bottom in the toolbar. There you can choose your language. So we start with the fifth session, Internet Governance, Gender, and Intersectionality. What can a gender approach do for technology policies? This session is aimed at discussing with the LACIGF community how gender-based approaches may contribute to the development of public and private policies of the Internet, and the implementation of technologies should adopt an intersectional look, enabling women with their gender rights, and not just women, but LGBTQI in Latin America. Considering that this is a novel topic in this space, the discussion will seek perspectives of the representatives of different sectors on questions guiding to this topic and in cases that cause problems in our region. The session will be divided into three parts. The first will be devoted to understanding challenges and identifying the good practices implemented by each sector on issues such as online gender violence and the inclusion and participation in the development of policies. The second consists in a small group discussion based on scenarios or real cases that will be aimed at seeing how each sector could collaborate in meeting those challenges to Internet governance based on a gender perspective in each of these situations. So soon we will share you'll see on the screen the data of the other rooms. And remember that in order to access to those rooms, you must disconnect to the current session Zoom webinar, and you must log in into the new Zoom session. And once the discussion is over, you'll have to come back to this session, to the Zoom webinar. We ask you please not to share the data, links, or passwords of this session. And if you need any help, you may ask for it on the chat. And finally, in the third part, we will summarize the discussions of the working groups, and we will try to recap on the contents of the session to see what we should be aiming at in the future. We invite all the participants to please write your questions in the Q&A panel, and we will devote some time for that purpose. So now we'll welcome the chair of the session, Jamila Venturini. Thank you, Claudia. Good morning, everyone. All those attending this fifth session of LACIGF, we're going to discuss about Internet governance, gender, and so what the technologies could be doing for this. This is the first part that we have a chance to discuss from a gender perspective, and we can discuss the political impact of technical discussions understood as technical discussions that take place in the various settings of Internet governance. Our proposal is to see how gender policies have an impact on Internet governance and the other way around. That is, the space, and we will discuss attacks to targeting different groups, or online gender violence, or even the impact of this in the public policies in government, and how it could impact women. I'm sorry, voice is not coming well. And how these groups are affected by this. So this is a core topic. It was identified by the expanded LACIGF community, and they considered it was a priority. So what we propose is to think how gender may be understood from a cross-cutting perspective, and we should analyze then what are the different groups that can be targeted, what are the voices that are missing, and what we can do so that they may be duly represented and have a voice in decision making.
In the first part of this session, we'll have a panel that will be discussing, we're responding to 3 rounds of questions. We have experts on these different topics with a lot of expertise on the topic of gender and technologies from different standpoints, and also based on the roles in the private sector, the civil society, the technical community, and also in the government, in the state. With us, we have Anaís Córdoba, who's a member of the Communication Workshop for Women. It's a feminist organization in Ecuador. We have Carolina Caeiro, who's project coordinator at LACNIC in IT Women. We have Dania Centeno, who is a lawyer from Mexico, who has a master's degree in human rights from the Utrecht University and currently in charge of public policies for Twitter in Mexico, and Margarita Escobar, who is a representative in El Salvador, and among other things, she deals with technologies in the context of human rights and the rights of women. I will start with the first round of questions, and I would like to invite the members of the panel to respond in the order I mentioned. First Anaís, then Carolina, then Dania, and finally the representative Margarita Escobar. To start this conversation, I would like to listen to your reflections on the experience of involving gender and parity distribution on the discussions on public policies related to technologies from the standpoint of where you work. How do you perceive the possibilities and the opportunities to participate in the development of policies related to technologies, and also the possibility or the difficulties in including a gender perspective or the implications in these policies? Anaís, you have the floor. Good morning from Ecuador. It's 9 a.m. Thank you for the invitation. On behalf of the Workshop on Communication and Women, we have an aid line, which is freedom through the internet, and this supports a feminist women in the case of digital issues. We work remotely with women, young girls, and adolescents, and in the context of LGBTI, we have supported them in the need of discussing and seeing how digital gender violence and any form of harassment and discrimination which happens through the ICTs has a direct impact and a real impact on the lives of women, young girls of the LGBTI groups. So this not only has an impact on their physical health, but also on their mental health. For us, this has been one of the main points in order to make decision-making on public policies more visible. There is a debate around gender violence that is not fully understood by many operators in the legal area and those in charge of developing public policies, and even people involved in technologies, and how this directly affects our lives. That is why I want would like to state how violence is viewed in the lives of women and people of the LGBTI groups. One of the most common ways is fear and distance from technologies. So the digital divide becomes even deeper. So particularly people who are involved in public policies should be aware of this. And gender violence deepens the gap because once people have access, there is a lot of aggression. Another direct effect on the lives of women, young girls, and children of LGBTI is the impression of being controlled and supervised and monitored at all times. Very often, the aggressors are people they know. So this affects trust, or they are people they do not know but have information on you. And that is why this impression of control is perceived. And this leads to a lot of stress, not only stress because I'm stressed because of the workload I have, but this is ongoing stress in the sense that this then leads to anxiety and then distancing from technology. This has an impact on education, this has an impact on work, this has an impact on other areas and affects the threats for the women of the LGBTI groups. We have started with a process with this workshop investigating what happens with digital violence in the country, and also to see what was the response, what is the response of the state as well as of the different platforms as to what is happening here. What we have found is that if gender violence is not recognized, then there is no approach to digital gender violence. In other words, it's very difficult to understand these. Nevertheless, in the penal code, recognition is made of certain digital sexual violence, for example, pornographic content without consent, violation of privacy. But these things are not being applied because there is no understanding or recognition on behalf of the justice and public officials of what gender violence implies, even digital gender violence. So the main task we have at hand is to understand this jointly together. So that you have an idea, we have estimated, of course, with a bias of the situation, that one out of every 10 women in Ecuador does not have access to technologies, and they don't have the opportunity of accessing technologies in terms of communications. In other words, this implies that if they do have access, they will suffer aggression, but if they don't have access, then there are many women who really don't have the opportunity to access these options. And this is something that happens throughout Latin America. And in terms of public policies, if we have such an enormous digital divide, and if there's a gender divide, we really have to focus on the intersectionality. This does not include all women, but it includes more those women who live far away from the major cities. This affects women who are far away from technology because they economically don't have access to technology. So all this vision from our standpoint, from a feminist approach, requires intersectionality, and a civil society would do a constant request to recognize this in the context of gender and also to recognize the digital divide. Throughout Latin America, there are plans for digitalization, and this does not include digital violence, and even less with a focus on gender. So we think it is very important to recognize this on behalf of the various stakeholders involved in developing public policies, providers, and the state, which is the main actor, as well as the platforms and the social media, because we do see the need for having a response from all sides in order to mitigate violence. And I haven't even started to describe some of the cases of digital gender violence as a result of the COVID crisis. So I will stop now here. Thank you. Thank you very much. We'll be referring to gender violence a lot today. Thank you for introducing all the topics related to technology in this context. So I would like to invite all participants to join group number 4 that will continue discussing the implications of gender violence. So I'd like to invite Carolina to make her comments on this first question. Thank you, Jamila, for your introduction and for the opportunity of participating in this panel. In my case, as you mentioned, I'm coordinating the project on women and technology at LACNIC. LACNIC, for those of you to LACIGF, is the Internet Registry for Latin America and the Caribbean. We are part of what is called the Internet Technical Community. First of all, before starting with my comments, I'd like to say that it is wonderful that LACIGF is tackling the issue of gender violence more intensively from the standpoint of Internet governance. And the important is to focus on how we can achieve a greater diversity in the spaces that Internet provides. And from the standpoint of Internet governance, what LACNIC does is to coordinate the policy development process that establishes how the Internet number resources should be used in Latin America and the Caribbean, particularly IP addresses. And then it monitors compliance with the policies in terms of the number resources that we are responsible for in the region. So that is a function we have. So it is in this context that the project Women and Technology stems from the need of bringing women closer to the LACNIC community and to achieve a more active participation of women in the different spaces that are provided by this organization. I always like to say that if there is a divide, a gap in the participation of women in the technological field, then the technical community makes this even wider. And maybe this is a divide, a gap that is even harder. So we see then how there are initiatives out there and initiatives are being developed to attract women to programming and to technology. At LACNIC, we understand that it is important to actively work on the reality we have today and to facilitate a more diverse gender participation, trying to tear down the barriers that prevent women from participating. Now, specifically to give you an example, let me tell you about some of the activities we carry out in the context of the Women and Technology Group. Last year, we launched a code of conduct, and because LACNIC is part of the Secretariat of LACIGF, that is a code of conduct we also apply to this event. So this might seem to be a very basic initiative, but the fact that we do have this code of conduct seeks to guarantee that the spaces of our participation organized by LACNIC are safe, secure, and inclusive spaces for women of other sexual orientation. So in order to tackle this problem, this was one of the initiatives we included. This year, we have been working actively in opening up the space in terms of visibility and leadership of women in our community. We have a working line which addresses taking care of the gender balance in the agenda of the events we organize. This in order to guarantee the participation of women leaders of our organization and also so that they can play a role of attracting younger colleagues and serve as role models. On Wednesday, 14th September, we'll be launching a mentoring program for technical women in the spirit of preparing the next younger generation of women who can play an active role in technology and in the technical community in general. So to start the conversation, I wanted to tell you about these activities carried out by LACNIC in order to promote the activity of women in the development of policies in the context of gender. Thank you, Carolina. And I see that there is a need of reflecting on how we can cast a gender approach and awareness of the gender perspective from the different sectors. That is why it is so important to have a greater participation of women in the technical community, and so that this participation is carried out from a safe space and also promoted by examples and specific programs that contribute this to this. It's great to hear that. I will now give the floor to Dania Centeno so that she can tell us about her experience and her standpoint.
Hello, thank you for the invitation, Jamilia. It's a pleasure to be here to discuss how we see these issues and what we've been doing to address it. As was very well pointed out, this is a structural problem that goes beyond what one usually thinks. There are many things that have to be taken care of, and we need a mutual understanding, and we have to involve the various parties. For instance, last year we signed an agreement to collaborate in the elimination of violence against women and girls in Mexico. So we worked with the industry on several online platforms. So we committed ourselves to do a number of things. The first of which is that we try to constantly work with authorities and civil society organizations for the purpose of training. On Twitter, we have rules to address any abusive behavior in the platform, harassment, and we are now implementing new actions to see how things could be done better. And that is a priority. It's been a priority in the platform for several years, and we are working to see how we can improve further. So, as part of this line of action, as we see that, especially in Latin America, violence against women is increasing steadily, that's why we decided to become much more proactive to see how we can create partnerships both with other platforms, authorities, and civil society. So it's with this as a background that last year we signed an agreement with the Autonomous University of Mexico, and that's what we implemented to see what we can improve here. As I said, we also have rules because we are a platform who is especially concerned in defending the freedom of expression, a freedom of speech, and sometimes we see that there are conflicts between that right and sometimes it's difficult to draw a line and see where it's no longer a right, but it becomes, for instance, violence against women. So, one of the key victims here is privacy and authenticity, or inviting people to violence or harassment. So many issues that may be used to attack people because of gender issues. So, as part of the agreement that we mentioned, we hold workshops to explain the authorities how we explain those rules and what are the proper channels, because very often women go to the authorities, but they have a different understanding of what is gender violence. And when we are speaking online, then in the digital world, people are even less in agreement. So we discuss things with the authorities because, for instance, for non-consensual sexual relationships, so we sometimes have to work with the authorities, and we try to approach the civil society. We organize workshops trying to explain rules and how violations could be reported. And for instance, in and who to call when you have a problem in one of the platforms. So also the police and law enforcement and the cybernetic police are involved. So we are working trying to see in general terms what the structural problems are. You know that domestic violence has increased, and with the pandemic, it was already a bad problem before the pandemic, but now in Mexico, especially, it has grown. So we work with an institution that is a number of institutions that accompany the women that are in a situation of danger, in whose lives are threatened or jeopardized, and it's there's a kind of searcher. Whenever a woman goes to a platform and puts some keywords that imply as a secret message of domestic violence, then they tell them who to um, connect, to contact, and they get a direct line for help, either online or to the mobile phone. So this is one of the ways we find it. It's a direct assistance line, and from Twitter you can connect them. This is a national network, and I invite you to um, uh, join us. It's really helpful for the people, for the women living in violence, and especially women living in shelters. And as I said, we have the rules, we have the channels to report any violence on Twitter. We constantly hold webinars and seminars and workshops with the civil society, with authorities of the industry and police enforcement. And we try to promote a dialogue because sometimes we want to show them that, for instance, harassment in a platform should not be transferred to another when that is reported. So that is then what I wanted to tell you. So thank you for the introduction. And yes, we are going to discuss some of these things in the subgroup discussion. And I'd like to hear the voice of those that moderate the contents session. And groups 2 will discuss that, and group 4 will discuss gender violence. So I think it's good to listen to these proposals, especially those with multiple stakeholders. So it's good to see how from each sector we can contribute and see how we can respond or to make progress trying to respond to these challenges. So thank you. And thank you for introducing the issue of the specific case of the pandemic. Now I'm going to give the floor to Representative Margarita Escobar, who will tell us about the experience from the side of government. What have been the challenges and what they've done about it, the discussions that are ongoing, and maybe she could tell us about the peculiarities of a COVID pandemic in addition to an existing gender violence in the case of El Salvador, but also in other settings. Her mic is off. Her mic is off. Sorry, madam, we can't hear you. Yes, excuse me. Yes. Well, it's a pleasure to greet you all. Thank you for the presentations, and thank you, Jamila, for your invitation. I also wanted to say hello to the other participants. I am a politician, and I've been a representative for 14 years at the Congress in El Salvador, and I've had many very painful experiences concerning gender violence. However, we need to admit that the political engagement of women in policies in the South America has increased by 10% according to ECLAC figures. In El Salvador, the participation of female representatives has grown steadily, but we as women have quotas requiring the political parties to put at least 30% of women in their lists of candidates. However, when we introduce the topic gender violence and digital and technological development, news is not so good because we see something that is quite alarming. And it is that online gender violence is very harsh. It is gross, and in all the online platforms. And for a politician, a female politician, the most harmful way and is by damaging her honor. And unfortunately, the online platforms have helped expose very rudely the gender violence against female politicians. Any position, any stance that a representative, female representative adopts immediately is answered back by a harsh attack against that woman's honor. And what's the problem here? The problem is that many women in politics are going silent to avoid those attacks against their dignity and their honor. And the other thing is that this has a real and direct impact on families because the children go to school and the rest of the classmates start telling them, oh, they're saying that your mother or your grandmother do this or that or have done this or that. So there's a lot of instability in the families of these women. So women are deciding to go backward, not to participate, and not to be to get involved with politics because that's harmful to their family life. And that's a severe thing because for many years we had struggled to get more women in politics, but technology is causing us to go back in time. So, and there's another problem, the absence of any laws protecting the rights of women in online platforms. So this lack of a regulatory framework, of a legal framework, builds up on a lack of an institutional framework that dealing with gender violence in the online platform. Usually, the courts don't accept that an aggression in the social media. They don't consider that to be really harassment. So, uh, given that this is a multi-stakeholder system, violence against women is coming from everywhere, and the actors may be anonymous. They may be hackers, technological attackers, or fictitious, multiplied by in all the platforms. So gender violence turns into a behavior pattern in the and in the social media, and this especially targets political women. And we in El Salvador, we have worked very hard to increase the share of female representatives, and we have succeeded in a number of things. We have many female representatives, and we have passed many important laws dealing with gender violence or violence against women. We have a technical institutional unit at the assembly, the legislative assembly that provides assistance to the victims of the women that have been victims of violence, but not in the digital world. Currently, I'm chairing the economy committee, and I am part of the finances committee, and I have especially worked for to have a technology law, because in El Salvador we don't have anything. So um, we are about to complete the personal data protection law with a gender perspective. The advantage is that we don't have anything. So today, with COVID, it became much more apparent that technology is running is has a lag, and I'm afraid that we don't include gender violence. We will pass laws that are already obsolete.
So the data protection, personal data protection law includes this standpoint of protection of women too. There is another law, which is the second law that we'll now start to study, and this is called the Universal Access to the Internet Act. Our colleague spoke about the digital divide. Well, of course, there is digital divide because universal access to Internet as a human right does not exist for all. And this is creating even greater inequalities among women because they cannot even access the platforms for studying. COVID has closed down all schools. So how do you think children are responding to this? They have to access this through the internet, and the most poorest and most distant places, people do not have universal access to the internet. So many of them are not part of the education system because they do not have the opportunity of following the lessons virtually. So this law for universal access to the internet that we are working on is then supplemented by another thing that is very innovative, and I do hope that this will be enacted soon. Namely, this is the protection of human rights in the internet. At present, people believe that human rights are only protected when these happen in real life. But there is absolutely no legislation at all that promotes and defends human rights in the virtual digital platforms. So I have now presented a bill for protection of human rights, where this is clearly specified with legal consequences when these rights are then not respected. And of course, the right to respect the honor. This is included in the Constitution of El Salvador, but this not consider violence against the honor in the digital platforms. And I go back to my first points. This is the first thing that women politicians are attacked for. There are other projects that have to do with digital economy, with a gender perspective. And the knowledge society, this is also another bill that includes the gender perspective. So to conclude, if we do not have a legislation in line with what COVID has taught us, this in the sense that today platforms are here to stay. They will not go away. So we have to produce a legislation that is in line with this reality, and this so that all the public policies that we have achieved in real life now also look after issues of gender violence, but also are included in the digital platforms arena. Thank you. Thank you, Representative. There are many relevant topics that have to do with this session. I understand what you mentioned regarding the political gender violence. And also in our research, we have identified that this happens throughout the continent. And if you allow me, I would like to mention something I disagree on, but I think should be a point to discuss. And this is how technologies will make these issues viable. But there are some conservative groups that will use technologies for maintaining certain types of violences that already existed offline and will now transfer them online. So I think it is of crucial importance to consider many of the proposals you referred to. For example, personal data protection law with a gender perspective is also important. Maybe we could discuss this in the groups as well. I'd like to go now back to Anais, Carolina, and Dania so that they share their comments on the impact as to how they view gender violence, and also, like the representative Escobar was saying, thinking of other types of contacts that happen as a result of the migration to the digital world, but specifically for women, including this intersectional approach that Anais referred to. And I'm joining the two last questions into just one question, so maybe in a couple of minutes we can go over to the group discussion. To the participants, let me tell you that at this stage, we won't include a Q&A session. The idea is to have this interaction in the group work that I will explain in a while. So Anais, you now have the floor. Thank you, Jamila. One of the things that happened during the COVID, and people say there is more violence against women, and we realize that this is not that there is more violence, but the existing violence is now more visible. There was everything was then shifted over, sorry, to the virtual space. So this has become more recurrent during the COVID, and what still is a COVID in Ecuador, we are still confined. We realized that not only the health system was not working, but no system at all worked. So the only response was received from the civil society. And I think I'm not mistaken, but I think so. I think this happened in other Latin American countries. And those of us who are part of the workshop on communication in women supported many of the cases. We supported 3 or 4 cases of digital gender violence every month. But now we started receiving 3, 4, or 5 cases every week. So if we look at the difference, we note that there is an increase of recognizing digital violence, and the large majority of violence was focused on sexual digital violence. And one of the things that the representative was mentioning has to do with education. Education and teleworking has now shifted over to the digital arena, and with no kind of protection on these devices. So it now turns out that the increase in the number of cases that we receive on violence against children, as from the age of 5 up to the age of 10, has been quite impressive. In addition to that, the scale of violence included gender violence, because there was also a connotation of sexual violence. And the next victims were the mothers who realized the situation was happening. So there's not just one single form of violence that is occurring, but these are interrelated. And then there is always one additional one. It's not only sharing images without consent, but also hacking accounts. And I think this is a very important point, and something that the states haven't been unable to solve. The educational problem has not been solved in Latin America, not even in Ecuador. How are we going to work in this new context and in virtuality? Many don't even know anything about public data. They don't know about the ways in which education can occur in the form of interaction through these platforms. So what we have seen is that those I think there is an issue with the connection. Many of these groups are anti-rights groups, and I think Representative Escobar is more aware of this. Can you follow me? So there are many anti-rights groups that do massive attacks. Many of these are organized from Central America downwards towards Ecuador, towards Colombia, towards Ecuador and Peru, sorry. And these occur through digital means. This is on one hand. On the other hand, we realized that as the largest amount of violence that was happening is sexual violence, then we need to speak by all means on how to control this. Sexual violence is against the body of women and others that don't fit into the white heterosexual concept. So we not only read this as disseminating intimate images without consent, but everything that has to do with sexual violence with very severe connotations for the body, for self-esteem, and for the way people relate. So the platforms of the social media where social interaction is taking place during the COVID situation, we have to understand that we are working side by side with the surviving victims. We have to be aware of what this anxiety implies. And when you don't receive an answer, when you report something in the platform, this becomes a problem. Very often, these things that are reported are not answered. Dania highlighted the importance of having a stronger interaction with the civil society through the social media. We see that there is a need for this interaction virtually. This already existed, but there has been an increase in this. And here I would like to make reference to something that there is a vision, a need of recognizing that gender violence occurs throughout Latin America. And if there's no office that deals with the social platforms, you from Salvador will understand me, we have a problem here because we cannot resort to these platforms. I would like to finish now saying that we believe that the response from the civil society is very valid, and we really have to give the feminist approach to the states. In Ecuador, there is a law on public data that doesn't take gender into account at all. But we continue speaking about the feminist internet. When we speak about gender violence against women, we really have to have strategies to assist surviving survivors of gender violence, and to have support not only from the legal system, but also support through the social media and providers and the responsibility they have in the sense of democratizing the virtual spaces so that internet also is a feminist internet. Thank you, Anais, for your words. I'll now give the floor to Carolina, who will tell us about the challenges for including an intersectional approach for gender and combines the different forms of vulnerability, racial origin, age, socioeconomic status, plurality, and the way these are designed and developed, not only in the context of public policies, but also private policies related to the internet. And after that, we'll listen to Dania's comments on these two topics. Well, thank you, Jamila. In the case of the technical community, we see clearly that there is a challenge to achieve a greater diversity in those who participate in the development of policies and standards in the internet. So this will be the focus of group 1. So I encourage those people who are interested in this topic to go to that group, number 1. Now, it occurs that when we analyze this problem, gender violence is just one of the fronts where there is diversity is lacking, but there are many more. For example, language. In our region, whether we like it or not, Spanish is a predominating language, and the IETF is a space where English is a predominating language. So there is an issue regarding language, which also becomes a barrier. Then we have the geographical representation in Latin America and the Caribbean. There are some countries or regions that are not equally represented. If you go to IETF, and Juliana Guerra from Digital Rights, who will be the facilitator of the session I mentioned, has commented on this. So if you go to IETF, you see that there is a limited participation of Latin America and the Caribbean. And this can be extrapolated in the sense of the participation of people from rural communities, the language, the countries, all this is affected by the social and economic situation. We clearly see that there are multiple layers that make it even more complex to create a greater diversity in the internet governance, and this has to do with the intersectionality. And then in the case of the technical community, these inequalities are often of a structural nature, so it's very difficult to see how we can approach them.
So sometimes we see that women don't get too involved in the public policy development. And when we try to see the reasons, sometimes these are cultural reasons or gender issues, or because women do not choose engineering or related studies. So sometimes we have a constraint in when we try to change the structural problems. A few years ago, we talked with people in Argentina in an organization that's called Breach the Gap, and sometimes. And what they said was that they tried to promote influencers that would be the standard bearers of these issues, because as an organization and as a community, as a technical community, sometimes we are asked to add our efforts for the sake of those structural changes and cultural changes. For instance, the code of conduct, or recently um, we changed the possibilities of identifying with another gender, not just the classical choices. So that is just a detail, but the idea is that we are giving the message that we have a broader mind. And LACNIC has also is trying to promote working in with broader perspectives, trying to add to the discussion. Two examples. First of all, the different programs for LACNIC to members in the for members in the organization. Big efforts are made to bring the operators, small and large, in the region to make sure that we have representatives of each corner when trying to develop policies. And we also organize hands-on tutorials that try to carry this message and to push this message forward. And we try to engage women in the public policy making and to discuss the policies that are in being debated, so that the community may be ready to discuss and to contribute. So that is what LACNIC is doing, approaching intersectionality. So, Dania, could you please be brief so that we can wrap up this part of the panel? And then we have to listen to Margarita again, and after that, you will have the different panels, and you, of course, you're all invited to participate. Yes, thank you. I'm going to touch upon many of the things that have already been said, and I'm going to be brief, but I want to talk about my experience. I worked with civil society for 3 years, and well, in the past, I worked with gender violence and accompanying people that were being harassed in the platforms. And what I'd like to say is that you need to be very careful to see how you can provide protection to women, because both working with the civil society or here, the tendency is to say, well, we need laws, we have to regulate, we need specific laws for the platforms to so that people can be taken to court. But this provides a false protection, because laws are no protection when you have structural problems. What I've seen from my experience, that rather what we need is protocols so that the authorities won't make such a difference between online and offline, because sometimes a thread whatever the means, either in line or physically, may end up in the same, in physical damage, so harm, physical harm. So if the authorities don't have this perspective, I fully agree that, well, of course, all laws should be drafted with a gender perspective, but not thinking that when you go to the internet, everything is bad. Of course, there's a differential impact of the use of technologies and attacks online in men and in women. So we we need we don't have to create such a barrier between on and offline worlds. And so the authorities should acknowledge the fact that if a threat is online, it's just as valuable as it is in the offline world. So, for instance, femicide is um, when it's one of the example of the one of the things that have been, that many laws have been passed to consider them as especially aggravated crime, and many authorities want to pass laws trying to punish um, what's happening online, and sometimes they overdo it when they patrol it and they punish. For instance, they use that as an excuse to punish the opposition, the political opposition. So we need to see how we can favor the use of technology, but without jeopardizing the people's rights to exert all their other rights. So we need to see how we can create more partnerships. And now going back to what I said earlier, the most successful thing is uh, cuts. We please we'd like you to hear, to tell us whether you've seen attacks on Twitter, because that is one of the things that we consider a priority in our platform. So identify this sort of content or abusive accounts, please report them. Our doors are always open. I'm Dania Centeno. You just can contact me, and I'm in charge of that. Thank you. Now I give the floor to Representative Margarita Escobar, and after that, we'll wrap up, but you can continue to work in the split groups. I think that this is a very interesting debate, and it's very difficult to put an end to it. Thank you. First of all, I'd like to make reference to what our dear friend Dania has just said. Indeed, laws need to be very cautious not to do away with the freedoms that mankind has already guaranteed in our constitutions, such as the of speech, and it never can you interpret it as stigmatizing the use of technologies. And I want to be very clear, our philosophy when trying to promote all these laws is to enhance the use of technologies. Let me give you an example. I'm truly the representative that has promoted all these laws. El Salvador didn't have, had nobody, but we have adopted a law for electronic signature, and this is to give better certainty to technological signatures, or a law on e-commerce. And now we are currently debating the habeas data and the personal data protection laws. And we always use a gender approach. And we are also working to provide universal provision of internet and human rights. And here I want to dwell on it a little bit more carefully, because it's important to consider the bill that we are studying. They are aimed at rights, social justice, accessibility to all expression and association, guaranteeing that everybody has a right to look for, receive, and disseminate information freely on the internet with no censorship or interference. Everybody has a right to create partnerships online for different purposes, social, political, etc. It's also important to address diversity as one of the key elements of the laws, the regulations, and the institutions. Never can we make laws giving steps backwards after so many achievements in our countries. I want to state that very clearly. And the second thing is that never can you interpret that the new technologies will can be. We can never accept stigmas against technologies, but rather the countries. The countries that have no laws, we have suffered for that because people are not fully certain of many issues. For instance, how can you develop e-commerce if you don't have laws that regulating it, or habeas data, or personal data protection? And it's so we need to create a legal framework, but always trying to protect technology. We are not against technology, but rather the contrary. We need to see beyond. COVID made it very evident that technologies have been and will continue to be a real part in our lives. And I agree with Dania that we have to be very careful not to overdo it when addressing these problems. Finally, we are working in an amendment to the law on education, because the legal framework is obsolete for tertiary education, not just basic levels. Now, I think that societies need laws, not just behaviors or protocols or codes of conduct, because unless you legislate, nobody will abide by the law. So if a protocol is not binding, then it becomes part of the culture of a country, but it will not be enforced. And sometimes that's one of the problems that we have with gender violence. So sometimes the laws have to be very exact and call violence and use the true words if it's violence, and so that the courts will accept them as such. Thank you, Representative, and I want to thank all the panelists of this first session. It's been a great pleasure to hear you. And I'm so sad that I have to interrupt this. But we now have the group discussions, and I'm going to give you the links. You can see them there on the screen, but you also have them on the chat. You're all connected. So the first group will be chaired by Carolina Caeiro, who already participated in the panel, and Juliana Guerra, who's part of the digital rights. And we'll talk about the infrastructure technologies, and she would talk about the challenges of participating in the technical spaces. Group 2 will talk about intersectionality and discrimination in public policies based on the use of automated systems. So we have Paz Peña, who's an independent researcher on technology of human rights agenda, and she's part of Acoso.online, and an initiative to defend gender victims in Latin America and the Caribbean. We have Nina Daora, she has the podcast Oncunye, and she works incorporating a gender perspective, and she teaches concepts of computing systems free of charge and in a simple manner. Group 3 will discuss incorporating the gender perspective in the private development of content. This is one of the things that Dania said. And so we have MSKP and Anna Fuckelman, who is an expert on the topic, and she has developed Lunar Upper, the first upper on the menses, created in Argentina based on sustainability and human rights. And Group 4, regulation of the online gender violence. Regulating on online gender violence based on laws that punish the non-consensual dissemination of intimate images in the region. Margarita Escobar will be chairing that session, and Luz Barrera, who's a member of Luchadoras, and Denise Albornoz, director. She's the director of Hiperderecho, that work with online violence. So I invite you all to choose the group you consider to be most interesting, and there we can continue to discuss how we can respond to challenges in the region.
So we resume in a couple of minutes. In each group, you'll receive a notification on when you have to return.
Recuerdo que los links para ingresar.
Let me remind you that the links to join the groups are in the chat, and the topics of the topic are in the slide on the screen.
De sumar y ahí arrancamos con Juliana. Juli, no sé si te está funcionando el micrófono. ¿Estás ahí? Bueno, parece que Juliana se desconectó, así que le damos un minuto más para que, digamos, se pueda sumar más gente y vemos también si la recuperamos a Juliana y ahí comenzamos.